welcome. I'm Bruce Maxwell. I'm the director of the Institute on Ecosystems here at MSU. And this is the first distinguished lecturer program that we're having, and hope to continue to have one per month throughout the rest of this semester and into future years. So the idea here is that we try to select professors that are well established here on the MSU campus, that have been doing research in ecosystem science for a long time and have a lot to tell. So we're really looking forward to hearing about these. Tonight we have Dr. Robert Garrett, who is director of the Fish and Wildlife Ecology and Management Program in the Department of Ecology here at MSU. Bob has been around a while, and he's done some really interesting research on mammals of all kinds in this state and around the West, really. He got his PhD at the University of Minnesota, a master's at Penn State, and his BS degree at the University of Montana. So, no stranger to Montana. I won't say when he got that BS degree, but he was back there with me. Bob conducts basic and applied studies of mammals and their ecology in terrestrial and marine ecosystems. He has research as far away as Antarctica and as close as the Gallatin Valley. So his lecture will describe the origins of wild horses in North America, public policy regarding wild horse management on western rangelands, wild horse population ecology, and the current status of wild horse populations and management. He has been involved with wild horse ecology management for 30 years and recently resulted in his invitation to serve on the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council Committee of scientific experts charged with reviewing the state of knowledge regarding wild horse ecology and management. So this is indicative of his great knowledge in this particular area. Wild horse policy and management are at a critical crossroads, and decisions made in the next few years will have fundamental impacts on horses and all natural resources on rangeland occupied by horses, as well as local communities. So with that, it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Garrett and his program. Before you start, though, we're going to tell you about a little aspect of this program. At the end, we're going to have you take a survey. And we're really interested in this. First time we've tried something like this. But if you have a smartphone, you can get on and you'll be able to vote on different management options, as I understand it. So Rob will explain those. But before that, Madison will explain how to get set up here. So do you want to go ahead and do it?
Yeah, so we put the instructions up here on this slide, but essentially what you'll do in your web browser, if you have a smartphone, is go to kahoot.it, and that's it. Don't put .com at the end of it, just kahoot.it, and you'll navigate to that web page, and then it'll ask you to enter a game pin. So this is where that number comes in, and you press enter once you've entered that, and then you'll just enter a nickname into, after that point, basically identifying yourself and we'll, I guess when we get to the survey later on in the lecture, you'll see that pop up there. But as we go and actually start the survey, all of your answers remain anonymous. So it's not like your nickname's gonna show up when you answer. It's just a way of verifying, hey, I'm connected to this software. I'm able to participate in this survey. And again, that'll show up later on when we actually pull up the Kahoot page. And it's worth noting, if you enter in right now, and it says you're ready to go, you're in the game, just click your phone off, and then whenever, again, we get back to that survey, just click it on, re-navigate to that web page where you left it, and it should automatically just put you back on there. That was something we were like, oh no, everyone's names are disappearing whenever their phones turn off, but you're still connected when you've entered. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand right now, or before, again, we start the survey. If you're having difficulties, just let me know. And other than that, I think we should be good to go.
And we'll re-explain at the time
of the survey.
Okay, Bob. All right.
wheel. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out this evening on this winter night to hear a little bit about wild horses in the western rangelands here. It's not an issue that's really controversial here in Montana so much because we don't have much in the way of wild horses, but you move a little further south, that there's a lot of concern and a lot of interest in how we manage wild horses. And so I think Bruce gave you a pretty good synopsis of what I'm going to talk about. And what I'm trying to do is give you the background information on how horses got here and how they became protected, why they became protected, how they've been managed since they've become protected, and where we are today and where we might want to go into the future. And that's where, towards the end, after I've given you this foundation information, then I'm going to ask everybody to make their own decision, giving you a couple different management options, and we'll see what the diversity of opinions are here in the audience. So that should be a little bit of fun for everybody as well. So horses evolved in the northern hemisphere, and they had a really broad distribution. But along with mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, and everything else you see on this picture, horses were part of the big and famous Pleistocene extinction that occurred about 10 to 14,000 years ago. So after the Pleistocene, there were no longer horses in North America. But they continued to evolve in Eurasia, and about 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, humans started to domesticate horses. And so, and as they domesticated horses, and over thousands of years of selective breeding for different traits, they were primarily domesticated for the animals of burden, for transportation, and for warfare. And so different lineages of horses were bred in Eurasia, and then they spread out through human populations throughout Europe and North Africa. And they were brought back to North America when Europeans started to recolonize, or started to colonize North America about 500 years ago. And throughout that entire colonization period, and indeed through the early 1900s, horses were integral into all society in North America, both the colonial society and as things began to develop into big urban centers. And of course, this is epitomized in the West by the cowboy culture, which a cowboy has to be sitting on a horse, right? So there's a lot of mystique behind horses in the West because of this culture. And in addition to ranching communities, horses were also the horsepower behind the sodbuster era, when horses were used to plow up the native prairies and start row crop agriculture. And as soon as horses were introduced into North America, the indigenous people, the Native Americans, quickly acquired horses, and that really fundamentally changed all their cultures. It made these tribes much more mobile, and it really improved their quality of life as hunters and gatherers. So in the West, horses have had a big impact for a very long time. But at the start of the Industrial Revolution, around the turn of the 1900s, then we started manufacturing and inventing machines, and those machines quickly began to replace horses for agriculture and also for personal transportation. So people just didn't need as many horses, but there were a lot of horses around. And then in the post-World War II era, during that economic boom, there was a tremendous increase in the production of trucks, and specifically four-wheel drive trucks. They sort of came from the World War II era, from the original Jeeps. And the capacity of those trucks then to serve for many ranch chores then even further reduced the need for horses for ranches as well. And from the very beginning of the time when horses were introduced 500 years ago into North America up to present day, lots of horses escape humans and are free ranging, and they're also intentionally released as well when they're unwanted or you just can't afford to keep them anymore. So for 500 years we've been releasing horses, or they've been escaping, and they've self-aggregated into wild populations on much of our western rangeland. And these populations are self-sustaining. They reproduce and survive quite well as feral animals. And as feral animals, they had no legal status, and they were nobody's property. And because they had no legal status, anybody could do anything they wanted with wild horses up until recently. And so, because there was a large number of horses on the range, and they had an economic value for slaughter, then small groups of cowboys and wranglers developed commercial entities, and they were known as Mustangers. And these Mustangers went around and essentially gathered these horses as they were free for the taking and sent them to slaughter to make a profit, either to augment their normal wages or they could be full-time Mustangers. And it was these commercial Mustangers that controlled wild horse populations up until about 4 decades ago. But not all the techniques that Mustangers use could be considered humane as far as the treatment and the transport of animals. And a lady by the name of Velma Johnson, who lived in Reno, Nevada, in the mid-1950s, saw some of the treatment of horses that were being captured and sent to slaughter, and she was really concerned about the welfare of the horses. And so she started to become an activist, primarily, at least initially, just for local regulations to control how horses were gathered, how they were treated, and how they were shipped to slaughter. But this quickly turned into a national movement, and within 20 years, that national movement, and Velma Johnson got nicknamed during this advocacy period Wild Horse Annie. I almost forgot there looking down at that. So Wild Horse Annie is behind all this, and it was primarily for humane treatment of horses. But it evolved into protection of horses with the passage in Congress in 1971 of what's known as the Wild Free Ranging Horses and Barrel Act. This act established federal ownership over wild horses occupying western rangelands. So now they weren't free for the taking. It prohibited the exploitation or the destruction of wild horses by any private person. And it established that wild horses would be managed by federal agencies, and in this case, the primary agency has always been the Bureau of Land Management. Forest Service had some administrative roles as well. And the act declared that horses were to be treated as an integral part of the natural ecosystem. So we have Congress dictating what is a native component or a natural component of the ecosystem. So these were pretty strong protections for what were completely unprotected animals before this act was passed. This is the distribution of wild horses. Today, you can see that most horses occur in the Basin Range country of Nevada. We've also got some substantial concentrations of horses in the Oahe Desert, in southeastern Oregon, and in the Red Desert of southwestern Wyoming. In Montana, they're way up in the corner there. You can see the Pryor Mountains polygon there. Montana only has one wild horse herd. They're south of Billings, the Pryor Mountain herd, and it's managed at between 100 and 200 animals on public lands. Within 5 years of the time that the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Act was passed, management of horses became very controversial, and that controversy has followed through the entire history of the program up to this very day, and it's only going to get more controversial, at least in those places that have large numbers of horses. And anytime we get a public controversy that reaches national prominence, then Congress and federal agencies also often turn to the National Research Council, which is a non-government scientific organization that's chartered to provide objective scientific integration of scientific data and prepare reports that try to help inform public policy for both the managers, Congress, and the public that might be wanting to influence policy. And there's been 4 of these NRC reports on the Wild Horse and Burro Management Program since passage of the Act, with the most recent one published in 2013, and that was the one I served on the panel. I was also involved in the first 2 reports as well early in my career. And one of the charges of these panels was to try to evaluate what reasonable or what typical population growth rates are wild horses on the rangeland. Horses in captivity don't breed all that well, and some of the early claims about wild horse population growth after they were protected, most scientists didn't accept them as being realistic given what we knew about domestic horses. But before wild horses were protected by this act, there was no science. No one knew anything about free-ranging wild horses. So it was pretty much a clean state as far as their ecology and population dynamics until this controversy brewed, and then people started doing science on it. So what the NRC committee did is they looked at two sources of data. They looked at counts of populations in individual herds and looked at how those counts changed over time to estimate annual population growth rates. So that was one way they looked at growth rates. And then an independent type of data they used were program level data. Animals are controlled, populations are controlled by removing animals off the range, many tens and hundreds of thousands of horses. And so looking at the age structure of those horses that are being removed from the range, then you can calculate young adult ratios, as you see in this graph, that give you an index of the annual growth rates in the population. So the NRC committees concluded that growth rates varies from one herd to the next and within herds from year to year, so there's variability in growth rates. But both sources of data were really quite consistent, indicating that typical growth rates for wild horses on our rangelands are about 15 to 20% annually. So what that means from the standpoint of management, I'm going to illustrate with a pretty simple mathematical example. So right now, BLM estimates, or I should say last year, BLM estimated there was probably about 60,000 horses in federal rangelands in the West. And so if you multiply that number by 1.2, you get a prediction of how many horses would be on the rangeland in the next year if the population is growing at 20% annually. And so if I do that math down this column, what it shows is that left unmanaged, if they're growing at 20% annually, populations on our rangelands will double in 4 years and triple in 6 years. If we consider the more modest growth rate of 15%, populations will double in 5 years and triple in 8 years. So what might seem like a modest growth rate, when you start multiplying it out by years, it turns out to be a lot of animals pretty quickly. So no populations can grow indefinitely, and horses exist within an ecosystem, and there's always various ecological processes within an ecosystem that can limit and regulate any population of organisms within that ecosystem. And ecologists look at these processes and sort of categorize them into two general groups, and those are top-down and bottom-up processes. So here I've got a really simple ecosystem pyramid with predators at the top of the pyramid, wild horses after that, and then the resources required by wild horses, essentially forage and water, lower in the pyramid, and finally climate, which has a major impact on nearly all ecological processes, especially in places like arid and semi-arid areas in the West. So top-down regulation would be where predators are killing a large enough number of wild horses that they have a significant impact on the number of horses and the population growth rates. And in western US, we have 3 predators that are large enough to kill horses. We have bears, mountain lions, and wolves. But only mountain lions are very common in areas where we have horses right now. And there's been a fair amount of work done on population dynamics and mountain lion predation in areas where the two species are sympatric. And that work has demonstrated or shown that mountain lions are only effective on young horses. So they don't try to attack adult horses, they're primarily attacking animals young of the year and primarily in the first 6 months of life. And there's only been 2 studies in the 40 to almost 50 years that people have been doing population studies that have demonstrated that mountain lions killed enough animals in 2 small isolated horse herds to actually impact the growth rates of the horse populations. So from the standpoint of top-down regulation, the evidence that's been collected over nearly a half a century indicates that predators are not effective in controlling wild horse populations in almost any place in the West. So bottom-up regulation is where the resources at the bottom of the pyramid become limited, and those limited resources then control and regulate the wild horse populations. So we have a very rich body of literature on large mammal population dynamics that demonstrates that when animal densities are low, per capita resources for those animals to survive and reproduce well is quite high, and populations tend to grow at or near their biological maximum. But as those populations grow and animal densities increase, resources, per capita resources, begin to decline. And with that decline and that limitation of resources required by those animals, then there's a very predictable sequence of demographic changes that gradually start dampening the growth rate of these populations. Oh, I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong. And these mechanisms are clearly operating for wild horses as well. But at the bottom of the pyramid is climate, and all the places that we have horses, at least in the western United States, are arid to semi-arid areas. And one knows that those areas have tremendous climate variation from year to year. And this is a graphic of the drought severity in Nevada, which, remember, this is where most of the horses are found. And on the horizontal axis, you see year from 2000 to present. And on the vertical axis is the percent of the state of Nevada that's in a given drought severity. And drought severity is indicated by the color coding, with the darker colors indicating more severe droughts. So what you see, number one, is there's tremendous variability. You see periods where we had really good precipitation in Nevada, which would result in good forage production, good plant production in these arid systems, and reasonably good water availability that would support horses quite well, and they probably wouldn't be very resource limited during these periods of time. But you also see periods extending for multiple years where almost the entire state is in a period of severe to moderate drought. And under those conditions then, horses will be resource limited. Plants will respond by not growing as much, water availability will shrink quickly, and horses will become resource limited. So what's resource limitation look for horses on the range during a drought severity period? These are pictures taken of free-ranging horses on the western landscape. The top picture is from the west. On the bottom picture is from Australia. Australia is in a very different situation than us as far as horses. They've had some huge mass mortalities due to the severe droughts they've had in the last couple decades in Australia. But resource limitation essentially means that horses are dying a slow death due to starvation and dehydration. Many horses die of dehydration before they die of starvation. And under these severe drought conditions that last for relatively long periods of time, then the number of horses that die on the range can be quite large. And with those horses and being resource limited, then they have quite a bit of damage and deteriorate the range conditions, the health of the range as well. And neither the public nor land resource managers find these kind of conditions on the range to be acceptable. And so when these things happen, which they've happened quite frequently in the West in the past, then the public and many land managers demand that we do something, some sort of management intervention. And what generally happens is there's what's called an emergency gather. So horses are in very bad shape, there's no resources available on the range, it looks like the drought's going to continue, and to reduce the probability of a mass mortality event, the horses are gathered up and taken into captivity, and those horses that remain on the range might be supplied with artificial water sources and even forage as well to circumvent mass starvation. So resource limitation, bottom-up limitation for horses really does work, but society won't accept it. So we intervene when these things happen because they're not pretty. So if we ask the question, can horses regulate themselves? They can, but we won't let them. Predators can't do it, and resource limitation is not acceptable to our society. So in the absence of natural regulation, then the only way we can regulate horses on the western rangelands is purposeful manipulation of those populations. And so that's what's been going on for the last 40 years. Government agencies, primarily the Bureau of Land Management, actively manages the number of horses on the range. And the only management policy that's consistently used to control horses is to remove them from the range and bring them into captivity. In the last 40 years, over 200,000 horses have been gathered up from western public lands and put into captivity. And this little schematic sort of draws out what happens to those horses. So when horses are gathered, usually between 5,000 to 11,000 horses a year are gathered, specifically in herds that are believed to be overpopulated, and they are all moved into a short-term holding facilities. And those horses may be held in those facilities for anywhere to a couple months to a couple years. And some of those horses quickly move into private ownership through a really successful adopt-a-horse program. There might be a few of you in the audience that have adopted a wild horse. So BLM spends about $2,500 per horse to get them into private ownership through the adopt-a-horse program. And it's very successful, and most people are happy with their horses. But the maximum market a year for these wild horses in the adoption program is about 2,000 to 3,000. So that's about the maximum that BLM is able to place a year from their gathers. And they spend about $6.8 million placing those 2,000 to 3,000 horses each year out of their wild horse and burro budget. So the real crux of the problem is, what do we do with all those excess horses that weren't adopted quickly? Remember, it was 5,000 to 11,000 a year, and only 2,000 to 3,000 can be placed through the Adopt-a-Horse program a year. So Congress, what the law states, is that unadopted excess horses that are in captivity are to be destroyed in the most humane and cost-effective manner possible. But almost since the inception of active wild horse management, there's been the destruction of excess healthy unadopted horses has been prohibited either through congressional budget riders or administrative directives from BLM themselves. So what do we do with these horses that we can't place into private ownership, and we cannot euthanize? Well, what has been developed are long-term holding facilities. So animals that aren't adopted from the short-term facilities are transferred to long-term holding facilities, which are really private pastures, private ranches that are contracted by the federal government and paid for by the government for these private landowners to pasture maybe 1 or 1,000 to 1,500 horses. And they tend to get, I think, 10-year contracts to pasture a bunch of horses that could not be adopted. And those animals are then put in pasture in these long-term holding facilities until they deteriorate due to old age and either euthanized or die. So it costs BLM and the Wild Horse Program about $1,100 per horse per year to house them in the long-term holding facilities. And the average age of the horse that's transferred from short-term holding facilities to long-term is about 7 years. And the average age of death in horses in long-term holding facilities is 22 years. This is based on hundreds of thousands of records of horses that the NRC committee put together from BLM's records. So that means each horse that isn't adopted, that's put into long-term holding facilities, will be there on average about 15 years and will cost about $16,500 per unadopted horse. And it's the high cost of maintaining these unadopted horses in captivity that's at the crux of the problem we have right now. BLM is currently spending about $50 million a year to warehouse 44,000 horses in captivity until they die of old age. And that's 60% of the annual budget, the wild horse and burro budget. So it leaves very little left for active management on the range because of these excess horses. So when I served on the NRC, the most recent NRC committee, the committee wasn't charged with looking at the economics of the wild horse and burro program. Specifically, wasn't charged to do so. But a colleague of mine that was on the committee and I, over many conversations in the evening after our committee meetings, decided it was really important for public policy for somebody to work up the economics of what's going on here. And so what we did is we took the data available that BLM provided to the NRC committee, and we worked it up so that we could project how many horses would need to be removed from the range if they maintained the policy, the ongoing policy, how many of those would be transferred to long-term holding facilities, and how many of those, and how long they'd be in those facilities, and how the facility would grow over time, how many horses would be in a facility, and how much it would cost. And essentially, we concluded that it was an unsustainable policy, that by 2030, we would have spent over $1 billion maintaining these horses in long-term captivity, and that would continue to increase as we continue to remove horses from the range. So we concluded that the wild horse program was essentially unsustainable, and that something was going to happen to break this management model. And indeed, no more than a year and a half after the NRC report was published, the 2013 report was published, Congress decided not to continue to increase the wild horse and burro budget. So as the number of unadopted horses increased in these long-term holding facilities, they had to continue to ask for increasing appropriations to pay for warehousing more and more horses. And Congress finally said, this is a black hole, enough is enough. We're not going to increase your budget. And so at that point then, BLM had no choice but to curtail their aggressive removal program and only take 2,000 to 3,000 horses off the range, which is what they could place through the Adopt a Horse program. So they didn't grow the number of animals on long-term captivity because they had no money to contract any more long-term holding facilities. So if we go back to that mathematical example, starting from 2017, where we have 60 horses, and remove 3,000 horses, and assuming a 20% growth rate, this is what we're looking at, wild horse population in the West doing now under the current management regime of very restricted removals. And many professionals, myself and many professionals, consider this the worst case scenario. Free-ranging horses, under this scenario, free-ranging horses are going to become severely resource limited. We're going to see a lot more birds and a lot more animals that look like this. Large numbers of horses will die on the range. Plant communities and water resources will become severely degraded. Livestock grazing on those public rangelands that are currently occupied by horses will have to be severely curtailed or completely eliminated. And of course, all native wildlife will be severely impacted by the degraded rangelands. All public uses will be negatively impacted. And all of these consequences will put BLM in violation of numerous congressional mandates for effective and responsible management of our public resources. Clearly, a crisis. So while it's not pleasant to think about, wild horse population control requires horse deaths. So really, the fundamental policy and management decision is when, where, how many, and how horses will die. So under the current policy of very minimal management, very minimal removal, most horses will die on the range from resource limitation. If we revert back to our previous policy of aggressive removals and then and then moving the unadopted horses into long-term holding facilities, then most horses will die in those long-term holding facilities after being in captivity for 10 to up to 20 years. Recently, there's a public advisory panel that advises BLM, made up of a diverse group of people in the public that represent different constituency groups. And recently, that public advisory group recommended aggressive removals of wild horses on the west, and then quickly euthanizing animals that aren't placed in the Adopt a Horse program, what's called full implementation of the Wild Horse and Burro Act, because remember, the language in the act is actually mandating this. So there's no good options here, right? Every one of these, we're looking at death in some way that there's at least significant segments of society are going to find unacceptable. And what really makes it unacceptable is the sheer numbers of horses we're talking about. So the biological problem is these growth rates, and the management problem is the annual increment that these growth rates produce that would have to be removed from the range just to keep the population static. Those are really large numbers. If we don't remove them, then those really large numbers, one of those yellow circles that says death, large numbers have to fit into one of those circles. And so it's the number of horses that are being added to the population each year that's really making this a gnarly problem for society. So there are mechanisms that we could develop a sustainable wild horse management program, and that would require reducing the annual increment, because that's what's so difficult to manage. That's what's so hard to accept, having tens of thousands of horses in any one of those yellow circles. The recent NRC committee identified the fact that the tools are available to have a sustainable wild horse management program. They exist today, and it's talked about in the report. And essentially, there's two effective strategies that would need to be paired together to make a sustainable program. The first is to reduce the base population from what it is now, 60,000. BLM has identified that the appropriate management level, the goal that they've always been trying to reach in our wild horse and burro program for 40 years, is to have about 24,000 horses on the range. And that, they believe, is a reasonable balance between free-ranging horses and all the other public uses of those rangelands in a multiple-use management paradigm. And so one of the strategies is to reduce the base population to that appropriate management level through gathering and removal of horses, something we know how to do really well. The second strategy is to reduce annual growth rates. So there's been a 40-year history of contraceptive research on wild horses. And that research by many different groups have developed a number of different technologies that can inhibit reproduction on horses that are effective. And two of these contraceptive agents has been certified by the EPA to be used specifically for wild horse population management. So then if we put these two effective strategies together, we think we could have a sustainable program. So we reduce the base population to appropriate management level, and we reduce the growth rate from 20% to 10%, which all the work that we've done on contraceptive agents, and specifically applying contraceptive agents in the real world conditions, is about the best we can expect from reproductive control, about a halving of the population growth rates through reproductive inhibition. So if we did those two things, then we have about 24,000 animals on the range. The population would grow at 10% annually, and that would produce an annual increment of about 2,300 to 2,400 horses, which is right within the range of what the market can bear for adopting animals. And so then, if we removed that increment every year, the population would be stable. The horses that were removed from the range would go into adoption after a short period of captivity, and we would have a sustainable program. So in order to do this, it's taken 40 years for us to get to where we are now. In order to do this, it would take time. It might take, if it was aggressive, it might take 5 years. If it was less aggressive, it might take 10 years. But it would take more money to do this. So 2 things would have to happen, and that would be that society would have to support a program like this, and not only support verbally, but to lobby Congress to appropriate more money to actually implement it. But the gnarly issue is, what do we do with all those horses that we have to take off the range, another 40,000 horses, in order to get it down to that appropriate management level? And so that's where the rubber sort of hits the road. Now, you've just heard the history of wild horses. I've given you the science, and I bet you all of you have heard, and maybe you even said, you want to use the best, you want to see natural resource agencies use the best available science to institute the most scientifically justified natural resource management policies. So I'm an expert in this field for 35 years. I've given you the best available science right now in a little synopsis. And so now you have an opportunity to make an informed decision about what best available science and what kind of management option we should apply to try to get out of the conundrum that we're in right now. So I'm going to give you 4 management options that are built off of what I've given you, and talk to you about the pros and cons in a very simple way, I hope, and objective way, I'm hoping. And then we're going to let you pull out your smartphones and open up that Kahoot app and tell me which management program you think is right for this program. So the first option is minimal management. That's what's going on now. Okay, only taking 2,000 or 3,000 horses off the range. What would that do to the wild horse and burro budget? Nothing. It would stay the same, because most of that budget's already paying for the 44,000 horses in captivity, and so there would be no increase to taxpayer for this management option. Range health would be severely degraded because the populations are going to be growing at 20% annually, and we're going to have lots of horses dying on the range. So we can revert back to the management policy we had before Congress decided not to appropriate any additional money, and that is to capture and put all the excess horses that can't be adopted into long-term holding facilities. This would require a lot more money. We're estimating that probably BLM's annual budget, which right now is $80 million a year, would probably need to be doubled, because at least twice that many horses would be going into captivity. So we'd have to go from an $80 million annual budget to maybe $160 million a year. Range health would be reasonably good, because we would have reasonable control of horse numbers. Not too many horses would die on the range, because we're taking them off the range before they get severely resource limited. But a whole lot of horses would be, tens of thousands of horses would be dying in those long-term holding facilities. And then we've got the recent proposal, essentially from the Public Advisory Board, that suggests that animals are captured aggressively to reduce the population to appropriate management level, and euthanized soon after it's determined that they cannot be adopted. So this would actually reduce the budget, because we wouldn't have excess horses that are in long-term holding facilities would be dwindling quickly as those natural deaths occurred, or euthanasia when they physiologically deteriorated. Rangeland health would be really good, because we need the appropriate management level. There would be very few horse deaths on the range, but there would be a whole lot of horse deaths in captivity. And finally, the scenario that I described there at the end of the presentation, where we capture horses, remove them down to the appropriate management level, apply contraceptives to those horses we leave on the range to reduce the growth rate, and we euthanize the horses that we took off the range So we're not adding to the 44,000 that are already in captivity. This would require an increase in the budget because that's a lot more activity, and administration of contraceptives costs money. That's added to the program. Range health would be really good. The number of horses dying on the range would be very low because we have managed them at appropriate management levels. And horse deaths in captivity, at least over the time, would decline because we're not adding more horses to that captive population. So there are your choices. Anybody smiling yet? So, all right. So now that I've described those options, are you really only thinking about the best available science right now and trying to decide what you're going to select on that Kahoot app when you open up your phone? Well, I bet not. I bet you right now, every one of you have a whole suite of personal values that you're bringing to bear to try to make a decision on which one of those management options are available. There's no good options, right? Here, but we have to do something. And doing nothing is a conscious decision that has consequences. So all of you are thinking about this from your own perspective. And maybe this is a suite of values and perspectives that different people might be weighing differently. So there might be folks in the audience that really care only about those individual horses. And everything else is subservient to that. So they're concerned about the fate of the individual horses that we're talking about. There's probably other people in the audience that are most concerned of having nice, healthy western ecosystems on our public lands to support our native fish and wildlife populations. Still, I bet you there's other people in the audience that are most concerned about the local communities that depend on those public lands for their economic livelihood. And in those cases, you might be thinking more about rangeland health from the standpoint of being able to support agriculture and livestock production in all these ranching communities that are absolutely dependent on public lands grazing in order to maintain viable agricultural operations. And still other folks in here might be most concerned about how much all of this costs and the taxpayer cost. And in that case, then you might be thinking your highest priority in making a management decision might be program sustainability at a reasonable cost. And so what one can think then is that each of you, when you vote on one of these management options, you're going to bring in these large suite of personal values to make a decision on what you think is the right or the most appropriate decision for management in the future. Now, before we have you open up the app, I've got these up again. These are hard choices, aren't they? That was in the title, hard choices, and now I'm going to let you guys have the opportunity to make those hard choices. But before I do, I'll open up the audience to some questions about these management options for just a brief period of time to make sure that everybody's got the information they need to make decisions. So are there any questions about the options that I'm proposing? Yes?
Option D, you said requires more money.
Yes.
Initially.
Yes.
But over time, it would...
Over time, after the transition period, that animals were removed to appropriate management levels and contraception was applied, then that cost for the transition would go away, and the fate of all those excess horses during that transition period, whatever fate you decide for those, that would eventually go away because there would be no more need for long-term holding facilities, euthanasia, or sell, which is just another word for euthanasia if you sell them.
So short-term increased cost
and then a sustainable program with no horse deaths. But to get there, a big increase in money for a while, and a whole bunch of horses that have to come off the range and be taken care of one way or another. Okay? Yeah?
What do you project that budget increase to be for option B, from mating wing to what?
You know, it would depend on so many things. It would depend on how aggressively it moved forward. It would depend on whether or not society would really accept euthanizing those 40,000 horses, or whether that option would get much more expensive because they're going to be added to the long-term holding facility. I only given you 4 options because I didn't want to make it too complicated, and the Kahoot software only can handle 4 options. So I'm giving you essentially an option that doesn't hugely increase the budget and gets us sustainable, but you could get to that sustainable program as well by taking all those horses off the range and doubling the long-term holding facility, which would more than double the budget, because you have to double the budget to take care of those 40,000 horses, and you have to increase the budget to implement the contraceptive end of things.
Thank you.
Okay? Yeah?
Was there any discussion about euthanizing the horses that are currently in the long-term holding facilities?
No. I mean, there's certainly parts of society that would really like to see that, because that would free up the money to implement a transition to a more sustainable program. But it is 44,000 horses. Sorry.
What happens to the euthanized horses?
That is a difficult issue, because when Congress wrote the law that protected horses and mandated that excess horses be destroyed if they can't be placed into adoption relatively quickly, they also mandated that those horses cannot be turned into any commercial products. And the reason for that is, I think, is they didn't want the federal government getting into a money-making program of harvesting horses to feed their budgets. And there's a very strong revulsion to the idea, especially of slaughtering horses for human consumption in North America. And so something would have to change in the law to allow slaughtered horses to be used for something useful.
We'll let the Humane Society deal with it for dog food.
If society wanted to do that, that would be fine. Okay, one more question, then we're going to vote. Yeah, wave in the back.
Do you know the method of euthanasia used for horses?
Well, horses are destroyed in professional abattoirs the same way cows and many of our other agricultural animals are. So it's a very humane method for slaughtering horses in captive facility. Yeah, it's captive birth. But right now, there's no facility in the United States that is certified to slaughter any horses. And Congress did that. So any horses, your domestic horses that are sold at sale now, if they aren't bought by someone, then they're bought by probably a sales representative that's shipping to Mexico or Canada where they're slaughtered.